Okay. Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome back after our Hanukkah break. We will also be taking a break just for the holidays next week, and then resuming after that. This year is the first in a 3-year series on Rabbi Meir. Tonight we're going to speak about his character and the different agaritas that we see about him throughout the different Gemaras. And the next year we'll be speaking about his really interesting, intriguing relationship with Elisha ben Abuya, his Rebbe who went off the derech and was called after that Acher. And we will also be discussing in the third year his different sayings in Pirkei Avot. So each year will stand on its own. So tonight we'll be beginning with Rabbi Meir, the Luminary, letters, parables, and a single torch. Okay, so just a little bit of a background, and before I begin, I want to give credit to Rav Ephraim Goldberg. A lot of this year was also built upon his ideas and also to the encyclopedia and Sefer Agada. Okay, so Rabbi Meir was one of the greatest Tanaim. Okay, the Tanaim are the authors whose quotes are mentioned in the Mishnah. They're canonized in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi went around and collected the notes from the different Batei Midrash, and the ones that were put into the Mishnah, so those are the Tanaim that appear in the Mishnah. And he had 3 Rabbeim. The 3 Rabbeim that he had Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, and Elisha ben Abuya, who we will speak about next week. His father's house and his origins aren't quite clear. We're going to see in one of the next sources that he is a descendant of a Roman convert. He lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. He was the third most quoted in Shas, which is a pretty big deal. And he lived in a time of tumultuous national times, and also on a personal level. He had a tumultuous life. He witnessed the murder of his Rabbeim. His father-in-law was murdered. His mother-in-law was murdered. Rabbi Meir was married to Bruria. Anyone who participated in the series on Bruria, we mentioned him as a sideline, and now he is coming into focus, and Bruria is going to be on the sideline in these shiurim. In the national times, it was a time of distress. It was after the Roman conquest, after the revolt of Bar Kokhba, the fall of Beitar. The Romans were trying to spiritually eradicate our Jewish identity, our Jewish lives. And so he lived during this time when there were the Hadrian decrees of what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, what was punishable by death. We'll see later on how the completion of his ordination was such a traumatic event, and also tragic because the one that ordinated him was murdered on the spot. A few times he had to escape to Chutz La'aretz, and then he would come back, and he finished off the last years of his life in Chutz La'aretz, even though we know that he had this great love of Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe, he had 12,000 pairs of students that were completely wiped out in the plague, and this is what we mourn during the time of Sfirat HaOmer. And he had 5 surviving students. The leading one of these 5 surviving students was Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Akiva didn't have that chance. He was executed. He didn't have that chance to complete the smicha for Rabbi Meir. And so we're going to see that his smicha takes place. We'll read that as we carry along. But what I wanted to begin with is the source where we see about his name, right? Going back to the way that we usually start our discussions of a Tanakh character, we start with their name, their birth. The name is given at birth, right? So here we also see that even the Gemara speaks about his name, why he is called Rabbi Meir. Okay, so if we look at source number one in and of itself is just it's a fascinating source, and it says Amar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, and he says it is known before God, right? The one that created the world. She'en b'doro shel Rabbi Meir k'moto. There was no one in the generation of Rabbi Meir that was like him. So why didn't they establish the halacha to go in accordance with his opinion? If he was so great, and we know that he had such this really sharp knowledge, sharp abilities to erudite and intelligence and knowledge. So what was the reason? And they give such an interesting reason. They
It
explain
means halacha in general or on a specific topic that they're discussing?
halacha in general. That they didn't go by his opinion. When they would come to decisions, if he was part of the decision making, he wasn't the one that they would say the halacha is like Rabbi Meir. So they explain here what is the reason for this. Shelo yachlu chaverav la'amod al sof da'ato. His colleagues were not able to discern the profundity of his opinion. Okay, he was so brilliant that he was able to show something that was tameh, that was pure, that was impure, and prove that it was he would say, Shehu Omer al Tame Tahor Umarelo Panim. He would say something that was impure, that it was pure, and show all these different proofs for how that's possible. And just the opposite, right? Something that was pure, how it's impure, and show all the different options. And so they weren't able to distinguish between, according to when this English translation on the left side of the page is the English translation of Steinsaltz. So according to what Steinsaltz is explaining, they were unable to distinguish between the statements that were halacha and those that were not. And there are different ways to kind of look at this and to understand it. Rav Ephraim was explaining how he just had this brilliance that he was so that he was just misunderstood. He was able to convince you of anything that it was hard to be able to have credibility, right? Because, and he kind of gave this example, if there's someone that is just so much greater in their ability to convince you of anything, and they could look at the same thing and convince you both ways completely, then they kind of lose their credibility, because what is their opinion, right? So here as well, because he had this this enormous depth of intelligence, that because of that, because of his brilliance, the halacha wasn't chosen to go according to his name, which is just interesting in and of itself. And it's taught in a Braita, Lo Rabbi Meir Shmo. His name wasn't Rabbi Meir, Ella Rabbi Nehorai Shmo. Right? My son Nehorai. And this is why we named him Nehorai, one of the reasons, right? So Lo Rabbi Meir Shmo, his name wasn't Rabbi Meir, rather it was Nehorai, which is the Aramaic meaning of Meir, which means to illuminate, to bring light. Lama nikra shmo Rabbi Meir? Why was he called this? Shehu Meir einei chachamim b'halacha. He illuminated the eyes of the sages in matters pertaining to halacha. Okay, so it's just this image of this great Tana who's called by the name of Meir because he's someone that opens people's eyes when there's darkness and we can't see and we don't know. He turns on the light switch, and we get that we can understand now. We can see it in a different way. Okay, the second source that we have here in Masechet Gittin is showing the story of from who he descended, right? As I said before, we're lacking familial connections, which is interesting in contrast to Bruria, right? With Bruria, we have very rich texts about what happens to each of her family members, about her mother and her father and her brother and her sister, and during those shiurim on Bruria, we spoke about that at length. Whereas with Rabbi Meir, we don't see any sort of familial connections. We see here the story of a Roman general. Okay, so it says here that the Shadar le Neron Kesar, the Roman authorities sent Nero the Caesar against the Jews, and when he came to Yerushalayim, he wanted to test out his fate. So what did he do? Shada gira lemizrach ata nafal b'Yerushalayim. He would throw his arrow towards the east, but it would fall in Yerushalayim. Then he would try shooting his arrow to the west, and it would fall in Yerushalayim. And he would shoot his arrow in all different directions. And where did it always land up? in Yerushalayim, right? Isn't that fate? That's where he's meant to go, meant to destroy Yerushalayim. And then he comes to Amar lo liyanuka, and this is also a very interesting phenomenon that we're going to see next week as well in the relationship between Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Abuya. This idea of going into a Beit Midrash or going and asking a child, "What are you studying?" And the pasuk, the verse that the child quotes, has to do with what's going on in your life. It's just a very, very interesting phenomenon that went on during those days. And he says, "Psukli psukacha." Tell me, what are you learning today? And he brings in the pasuk, "V'natati et nikmati be'Edom biyad ami Yisrael." I'm going to give my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of the people of Israel. So here, Nero, this Roman general, says, he understands what's going on here. It says, "Kedusha brichu bayi l'churvei beiti ubayi l'chforei yadei ba'ul gafra." He's explaining that Hashem wants to destroy his temple, and he wants to use me as this vessel, right? He wants to wipe his hands with that man, with me, right? And the Romans are associated with Edom as the descendants of Esav. So if I keep on going with this mission and I bring about this destruction, I will be eventually the nekama, the vengeance is going to come upon me. So he gets it. He understands from this pasuk that this child is learning. So what did he do? Arak v'azal v'yigar. He runs away and he becomes a convert. V'nafak mine Rabbi Meir. And ultimately Rabbi Meir descended from him. Fascinating story, right? Not only does Rabbi Meir come from converts, okay? He comes from a Roman convert that was coming with the purpose of destruction. And we know that during the time of Rabbi Meir, the nation suffered so heavily under the hand of the Roman oppressors. And here we see, interestingly, how Rabbi Meir comes from a convert, from a Roman he descends from a Roman ancestor. Okay, so 1 second. Okay, so here's the story that I mentioned before that we were speaking about his smicha, his ordination. Now, smicha, which is nowadays, as people say, that smicha doesn't exist, and smicha nowadays is really a certificate, and people have to learn for it and try very hard, and it's a big accomplishment. But it's not the smicha that's referred to in the Gemara. The smicha that's referred to in those times, smicha from the word samchut, which means authority, is that it comes from the line of Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu would pass down the Torah orally to the next person, and from person to person, from Moshe Sinai was the continuation of the tradition, right? And this transmission of the Torah was really at stake because, as we're going to see here in Masechet Sanhedrin, that they were not allowed to carry this on. It's like the Romans understood what was so important to the Jews, right? And we see that throughout the generations. We see that also in the Holocaust, that the Nazis knew, they knew our weak spots. They knew the points of us that were so important. And those were the parts that they would step in and try to destroy. And so we see here with the Romans that smicha, the continuation of our tradition from Moshe Sinai, was at stake at this time, that they weren't allowed to carry it out. As we see here, that at the time of the Rome, they issued decrees that shekol somech, anyone that ordinates, right, anyone that gives the smicha, yehareg, will be killed. Anyone that becomes ordinary will be killed. Ve'ir shesomchim ba techarev, even the city in which the person is receiving the ordination, that city will be destroyed. That's how much they want to uproot the Jewish tradition, the Jewish identity, right? So what did Yehuda ben Bava, Masa Yehuda ben Bava? So what did he do? He did something smart. He went between two huge mountains and between two big cities and two Tchumei Shabbat, between Usha and Shafram, and he made sure so that it was in a desolate place, so that none of the cities, right, that would be associated with it. So if this was something that would be revealed, none of the cities would be punished for this smicha. But he realized that, it was something that he had to risk his life to do in order to continue on this tradition. And so what did he do? V'samach sham chamisha zkenim. And there, that's where he ordinated five elders. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer ben Shemua. Okay, and it says here in the story, it's just a tragic story that it's that when they're caught, when they're caught, kivan shekiru evem behen amarlan, and so when their enemies revealed what was going on and understood what was happening to them, it kind of like makes me very emotional just to read this. He says, Banai Rutsu, right? Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, the one that was giving them an ordination, he says, my children. That's what he calls these rabbis. And he says, run for your lives. And they say to him, Rabbi, mate alecha, how can we leave you? What's going to happen to you? And he says to them, I'm standing here like a stone that cannot be moved. And he understood that he was frail, and there was no way that there was any way that he would possibly be able to be saved. So he stayed in his spot, and he told the rest of them to run, because otherwise, if they would have stayed, they also would have been killed. And it says that they destroyed him in such a way that they shot at him arrows, inserted 300 iron spears, make him appear like a sieve, something that's pierced with many holes in them. Okay, and then the Gemara goes on to explain what wasn't Rabbi Meir, didn't he receive his ordination from Rabbi Akiva? And they explain that he did receive it, but he was young at the time and it wasn't accepted. And now, after this ordination by Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, his ordination was complete. Okay, so here we just have the beginning, the introduction, where we understand his name and we understand where he descends from. We realize that we don't see the familial connections, and we see the completion of his smicha, and we understand that he's coming from these great sages that were so moser nefesh for the Torah. As we know the great stories of Rabbi Akiva, that at the time of his death, that he was smiling and they're combing his skin with fire, and their students ask him, why are you smiling? And he says, all my days I said I love Hashem. B'chol levavcha, that I was able to do. B'chol ma'odecha, I was able to do. Aval b'chol nafshecha, with my soul, I was never able to do that. Now I can fulfill it. That was his rabbi, right? That was his Rebbe. And so here we go on to understand his scholarly status. Okay, so if we look in Talmud Bavli and Masechet Yevamot, we have an interesting story, and it's in the context, also not such a happy context, of whether or not a woman is permitted to remarry if her husband drowns, okay, and the body is not found. So they come to the conclusion that if he drowns in a body of water with a visible end, then she is permitted to remarry, because they would have seen, right? Let's say it's a pool or a lake, but you can see all the sides. They would have seen if the person had emerged from the water. But if it's an endless body of water, like an ocean, right, that you can't see, it's possible that someone could have survived and we don't know about it. So therefore, the woman, unfortunately, is still in the status of a guna. We're not going into that. A very, very I forgot the word in English, ta'un. It's a very loaded topic. Okay, so, but that's just the context of what's going on here. So it's taught in a Braita that Rabbi Akiva says, Pam achat hayiti mehalech. One time I was traveling on a boat, and I saw another boat that was sinking at sea. And I was upset. I was distressed about the Talmid Chacham that was. And who was it? Rabbi Meir. He was on this boat. But when I got to Kshaliti Lemedinat Kaput Kaya, Bavi Ashavadan Lefanai Balacha. But when I came to this place called Cappadocia, which I'm not sure where it is, Rabbi Meir comes, sits down, and he speaks with me about halacha. And I say to him, Amarti lo bli, ma halacha? Like, what happened here? Mi halacha? How did you survive? What happened? And he has such an interesting story as well. It seems almost miraculous, right? And later on, we're also going to speak about how Rabbi Meir eventually is coined also Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, not from this story, but here you kind of see the sparks of miracles going on. What does he say? How does he survive? Amar, a wave took me to his friend, to the other wave. Then that wave took me to the next wave, until eventually it just threw me up onto the shore. right? And he was cast upon the dry land. And so Rabbi Akiva explains there, Marti Baltash I said in that moment, Kama Gdolim Divrei Chachamim. I realized how great are the words of sages who said what we mentioned before, water, Sheyesh Lem Sof, that's bound. The wife of someone who drowned, she's allowed to remarry. Maim She'en Lem Sof, like an ocean, Ishto Asura, his wife is not permitted because of a story like this, that Rabbi Meir, he saw Rabbi Meir, he was sure that Rabbi Meir was drowning in the ocean and suddenly miraculously appears as if nothing happened, and he's just going on about his halachic deliberation, and Rabbi Akiva is shocked and astounded. How did you survive? And then he realizes people can't survive, right? Okay, so to go on, in Talmud, the Masechet Sanhedrin, we see the type of drashas that he would give. And this also gives insight into his learning style. That Rabbi Yochanan says that Kihavi Darash Rabbi Meir Befirka, in his lectures, what would he do? He would give a third about halacha, he would give a third about Agada, and a third, sorry, just need to put the plug in to my computer. Hold on, sorry. Apologies. Just forget how fast the battery runs out. Okay, and a third, apologies for that, and a third would be about parables, okay? And Rabbi Yochanan says, Shalosh me'ot mishalot shualim hayulo leRabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, he had 300 parables about foxes, okay? And what we only have left are 3 of them. And they're parables that have to do with the idea of children receiving punishment for the actions of their elders. Also not something that we're going to get into now, but it's just very interesting. I find that that parables is something that Rabbi Meir uses as a third of his drashas. And also we see in the next source, Mishamet Rabbi Meir bitlu moshle mishalim, in the context of different things that ceased, that we see here from the time when Rabbi Meir died, others, those who relate parables, also ceased. So he was this man that represented parables, and parables is something that's it's a very powerful educational tool to transmit a message. And we see this idea of parables in other areas of his life. One of the areas that I was reminded of is the story that we also spoke about with Buria, the story of the death of their sons, right? That just to bring in that story about how his sons die over Shabbat, and Buria withholds this information from Rabbi Meir, so as not to ruin the Shabbat with mourning, because unless there's a need for it to be spoken about, then that's what one is meant to do. And she covers them with a sheet, and he comes back and he's looking for them. She waits for the Shabbos to go out, and then she brings a parable and she says to him, someone gave me something, a pikadon, which I forgot the word in English, but something that they gave me to like a loan. They gave me something, but I forgot the word. Okay, they gave me some. What's the word? What? No, I can't hear you. Anyway, I think people understand what a deposit. Yes, thank you. La picadon. Yes, okay. So they gave me a deposit, something to hold, and now they're coming back, and the master of it is asking for it to be returned, and now, should I return it? It's such an obvious question, right? Such an obvious answer. Why is she asking? And he says yes. And she said, okay. So too, she brings him upstairs and she shows him the bodies of their sons. And he cries and she says, but look what you just said, right? We were given these children as a deposit from a Kadosh Baruch Hu. They're not ours. They don't belong to us. They belong to Hashem. Hashem natan, Hashem lokach. Hashem gave it to us. And now we came back, right? This is a gift from God. This is not something that belongs to us. But through the parable, we were able to see her sensitivity and how she relayed that message. And so here as well, it's just interesting to see that Rabbi Meir was known as someone that used that creative tool, such a creative educational tool in order to transmit Torah. In addition to his parable, his skill of parables, we see in Masechet Megillah his enormous breadth of knowledge, that they tell this story, that there was a story about Rabbi Meir, that when he went to Asia Minor, and he went there to intersolate the year in Asia, right? La'aber Shana, it was a Shana Me'uberet, V'lo haya sham Megillah, and there wasn't a Megillah there. V'katva milibo v'kara. They didn't have Megillat Esther there. So what did he do? He wrote it by heart, and he read it, right? And we're going to speak about later what his profession as a scribe was. But just that ability to know Megillat Esther by heart and to on the spot, right? Everyone's there. And it's Purim, and they need to read the Megillah, and they're saying, "Oh no!" Right? It's kind of like, "Is there a doctor in the room?" Right? What do we do now? We don't have Megillat Esther. And Rabbi Meir, he stands up and he says, "Okay," and he writes the whole Megillah by heart. And here in Masechet Sanhedrin, in the next source, we see Amar Rabina that v'halo kol haro'eh Rabbi Meir b'beit hamidrash ki'ilu oker harei harim v'tochnan ze bazeh. It's so interesting. He explains that whoever sees, he says, whoever sees Rabbi Meir learning in the Beit HaMidrash, it's as if he's uprooting the highest of mountains and grinding them into each other. Okay, so Rav Ephraim Goldberg was explaining that there are two types of scholars. There are two types of Talmidei Chachamim. There's the type that are called the Sinai type and the type that are the Oker Harim, the mountain uprooters. The Sinai type are the ones that have that incredible encyclopedic memory, that they know everything by heart. I'm sure we could all think of different Talmidei Chachamim that literally, like, they just know the whole Torah by heart. They know everything, because just like it's called Sinai, because that's where the Torah was transmitted. So just like the Torah was given at Sinai, they are holding the Torah in their hearts completely and able to transmit it. Someone that's an Oker Harim, someone that uproots mountains, that imagery, right, that parable that we're speaking about is that analytical skill, that ability to take apart a sugya, to dissect, not just to know it by heart and be able to retain it, but to be able to analyze it and uproot it and see and hear and now. That Rabbi Meir, someone that saw him in the Beit Midrash, it was like Ki'ilu Oker Harei Harim, that he was uprooting mountains and grinding them together. Okay, and so we see that with Rabbi Meir, he was really both. Okay, in these two examples, we see he knew all of Megillat Esther by heart. He was able to write it over, and also he had this ability, this incredible ability to analyze the text. Okay. Alongside this incredible love of Torah and this fierce command of it, right? He also has a profession. And as we know that as well, the scholars of those days, many of them had professions. And so his profession was that he was a scribe, a sofer stam. Okay, so there's just a really powerful story in Masechet Eruvin, where he tells the story, Kshabati etza Rabbi Ishmael. When he came to his Rabbi Ishmael, he said to him, Beni, my son. I like how they use the words Beni. Okay, this is a relationship between a Rav and a Talmud. They're using the word son. Ma malachtecha, what is your work? What's your profession? And I said, Lavler ani, I'm a scribe. And he says, Beni. I could just imagine him, when a parent or a teacher sits you down and wants to tell you something really important, right? It's like, okay, sit down for this.
Sorry, who's talking to who here?
Sorry, Rabbi Meir is telling a story of when he came to study with Rabbi Ishmael.
Rabbi Ishmael asked him?
And he's recounting, yes, it's as if I'm telling the story about myself. So he's telling the story about Rabbi Ishmael asked him,
right, okay,
what his profession was. And when he said to him, I'm a scribe, Rabbi Ishmael responded and said, you should be really careful in your work, because your work is malachat shamayim. It's avodat kodesh. It's a heavenly service. Shema ata mechaser ot achat o miyater ot achat. Because if you miss out on one letter, or you add an additional letter that was not meant to be there, nimtzeta machriv et kol ha'ulam kulo. Right? You will end up destroying the whole world in its entirety. This is a great responsibility to be a scribe, that you cannot miss a letter and you cannot add a letter, right? And it's also a bit, now that I'm reading this again, it just thinking about as well, like the connection with Megillat Esther, that we're also not allowed to miss a letter, right? We have to hear every single letter, every single word. And that was what he was able to write down by heart. That story is marked out. He has this responsibility. He carries the weight of the world in the accuracy of each and every letter. And I think that this also is very suitable to someone that has such a great knowledge and such a great fiery sort of brilliance, right? That he's also has this craft alongside his Torah knowledge. And as well, we see that combination of the scholar and the scribe in the next source in Masechet Gittin, that when they're distinguishing the rabbis for the praises for what each rabbi is distinguished by, it's interesting. He's distinguished. Detanya, it says in a Braita, Isi ben Yehuda haya moneh shivchan shel chachamim. Right? He would count the praises of the chachamim. And what did he say about Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir chacham v'sofer. Rabbi Meir was a scholar and a scribe. And it's just interesting. I brought the rest of it in case anyone is interested in the source sheet, just to see how the different rabbis are, what they're distinguished for. But for the purposes of what we are learning tonight, we are going to carry on. Okay, the next part of the section, after we spoke about the background and his name, we spoke about his scholarly status, we're going to come to the Ben Adam l'chaviro, his relationship with others. What can we learn about Rabbi Meir through certain different stories of interactions? So there's this really interesting story as well in Vayikra Rabbah. It's also in the Gemara, and it appears in different places. And the context is that they're speaking about how that Rabbi Yishmael taught, Gadol Shalom, okay, how great is peace. ששם הגדול שנכתב בקדושה אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא יימחה במים כדי להטיל שלום בין איש לאשתו. Okay, this is in the context of the idea of sota, in a case where there's a suspicion that a woman has committed adultery. So she's taken by the Kohen Gadol, and there's a whole procession that goes on, but the name of God is erased in water, and she's meant to drink this whole sort of potion or whatever it was exactly, and so that the truth would be revealed. And this would bring to the idea, hopefully would bring to Shalom Bayis, right? Hopefully she would be proven innocent from such a procession, right? So he's saying, how great is Shalom Bayis that you're able to erase the name of God. And we know that we can never take one of the Aseret Dibrot is you can't take God's name in vain. We understand the importance of Shem Hashem, that even if we say Shem Hashem by accident, we need to say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. We have to be so careful with the name of God. But here, for the sake of Shalom Bayis, Hashem is willing to have his name be erased. Okay, so that's the context of the story that's going on. And so there's a story here that Rabbi Meir, he was teaching a Shabbos drasha, and there was this one woman who would come. She was a regular, and she really enjoyed hearing his lectures, which also shows that the accessibility, that he was also able to speak to the women of the time, that they would be able to come and listen to his lectures. And one time she waited until the lecture ended, and he had gone on longer than usual. And when she came back home, she found that the light had gone out, right? And as we know that the candles, the purpose of the candles is for Shalom Bayis, that you're able to see your food, you're able to see what's going on in your house so that you don't stumble. Okay, nowadays, we can't relate to that because we have Shabbos timers and we have lights, right? But at the time of candles, so she comes home, the light is out, and her husband says to her, "Where have you been?" And she explains to him what happened, and he says, I vow I will not let you enter here until you go and spit in the lecturer's face. Okay, that's the demand of her very likable husband, I shall say, right? And so what happens? She stays away from her husband, and her neighbors are starting to worry, and they see that they're separated. And she asks, "Are you still angry at each other? Let's go to Rabbi Meir." And so Rabbi, let's come with you to the lecture. And when Rabbi Meir saw them, he understood through Ruach HaKodesh what had happened. And so he made it out that his eye was hurting, okay? And he asks the women, and he says to them, is there anyone here that knows how to treat eyes, right? And so the neighbors say to her, oh, this is your chance, right? Like, go spit in his eye, and then you'll unbind your husband from his oath. But when she sat before him, she became afraid, and she said, I don't know. And he said, even if you spit in my eye 7 times, I know I will be cured. And that's what she did. And he says to her, go tell your husband, he told you to spit once, you spat 7 times. Wow. Okay, that's a crazy story. Okay. Right? That's just a crazy story. The husband wouldn't let her back in because she comes home late and the light is out, and we see her the separation between them and the tension and Rabbi Meir understands this, that there's so much tension between them, a problem of the Shalom Bayis, that he lets her spit in his eye and he pretends that it's for medical reasons. So his students come to him, and I always love that, right? Afterwards, it's kind of like, at the end of, I don't know if people know here about Full House. It's a very big American show. Growing up, that there was always like at the end, there was like the music at the end, and then the father would sit on the bed with the daughter, and they would speak about like what happened and the lessons that they learned from their lives, right? And it's kind of like this is the part, right, with the music comes on and the students come out, right? The lady walks off stage, the students come out, and they say, and they ask the question, right? And they say to him, Rabbi, this was said to him, should people come here and kach mevazin et Torah? Amru lo talmidav, Rabbi, kach mevazin et Torah? Like, isn't this something that's like scorning the Torah by letting them like spit in your eye? Weren't we able to, couldn't we have given you like a treatment for your eye? Because I guess they didn't realize. And he said, La dio lemeir liot shaveh lekono. Isn't it enough for Meir to be equal, to be like his master? What does that mean? The Tani Rabbi Ishmael, Gadol Shalom, Sheshem HaGadol Shenichtav B'Kedusha Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Yimacheh Al Hamayim B'Shvil Latir Shalom Ben Ish L'Ishto. Because it's been taught how great is peace, for even the great name of God, written in holiness, the holy blessed one said to blot it out in water so as to impose peace between husband and wife. If God is willing to erase his name, I'm willing to put myself in that position, right? To erase my kavod, right? For her to spit in my eye, to be able to bring about shalom bayis, right? So it's a beautiful.
Oh, that's really interesting. And just comparing this to what we learned with Buri and Rabbi Meir, what happened with them ultimately, which shalom bayis.
Oh, the famous Rashi you're speaking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting comparing the stories.
Yes. So I think that's why the opinion that I opted for at the end of that year was the opinion of Rav Eitam Zichrono Livracha, because of what he said, that it's most likely that there was a mistake, right, in the version of Rashi, in the transmission of the tradition, or whoever copied it over. Because exactly what you're saying from this story, it doesn't make sense how he would break up his own marriage when here he's putting himself out there and telling someone to spit in his eye for the sake of shalom bayis, right? So even so, this I think it's an even greater proof for why it's just the story could have been, right? But we don't know. We just don't know. Okay, so the next story. So here we just saw the story that was related between a husband and a wife. So here we see that in the next story in Gittin, that how he's what's the word? He's acting on the behalf of orphans, okay, and acting on the behalf of orphans, and also bringing peace between his fellows. And it just quickly to recount that story, that there was someone, an apotropos is a steward, he was in charge of the land of orphans, and he saw that they were selling the land that belonged to orphans, the steward, to purchase slaves with that money. And Rabbi Meir didn't allow this to happen because it went against halacha, okay. And they showed him in his dream, and it's not clear who is this they, right? Who showed him in this dream? I wish to destroy and you build. Okay, so he understood from here that this must have been a sign that God wanted the orphans to suffer for some reason that we don't understand, this financial collapse, and therefore it's preferable to keep letting the stewards sell the lands and use the proceeds to buy slaves, because for some reason that's what God wanted. But even so, afilu hachi lo eshkach. But even so, even though he saw this in this dream and he understood that this is as a sign, he paid no heed to his dream. And he said that word divrei chalomot is something he says often, lo ma'alin v'lo moridin. Divrei chalomot, words appearing in dreams, don't bring up and do not take down. We're going to see that he says that again later. Like, they have no weight. Dreams don't have weight they shouldn't impact how you act. Okay, so here we see that even though he had this dream, he was still going out for the orphans and still trying to protect them and still trying to bring tzedek, to bring justice. And the next story also is speaking about another story about how there were two people that they were incited by the Satan, and they were always constantly arguing. And Rabbi Meir would come to the place where they argued, and for 3 times in a row he stopped them from fighting, until finally he was able to bring peace between them. Until he was able to bring peace to them. Shamatek de Kamar, and he heard the Satan say, Vai da'afke Rabbi Meir lau gavra mi bete. You heard the Satan say, whoa, that Rabbi Meir removed that man, afke Rabbi Meir, lahu gavra, who is that man? The Satan from his house, that Rabbi Meir himself, by bringing peace between these two fellow men, he removed the Satan from their house. Okay, so here we see that this idea of shalom, of peace between husband and wife, between man to man, and also reading the story of going out there and bringing peace between 2 men, kind of like it's reminiscent of following in the ways of Aaron the Kohen, that he would also go and bring peace between 2 men that were fighting. He's going on in his ways. In their ways. And now, in addition to that, his relationship with the other sages. Okay, so interestingly, Rav Ephraim explains how that Rabbi Meir, he was very obstinate, he was very stubborn in his opinion, and he would hold fast to his opinion, right? But even so, we see in this story that there's a story that he permitted that for wine and oil to be mixed on Shabbos. And it was used for, nowadays we obviously don't do things like that, but in those days they used that for medical purposes, for a sick person. And the opinion says in the Breita that one may not mix wine and oil for a sick person. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Meir that he does allow it, right? He allows aftorfin yain v'shemen, he does allow that to happen. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Pam achat chash Rabbi Meir b'mei'av u'vikash litrof lo yain v'shemen. But one time he really wasn't feeling well in his intestines, and they said, let us mix, right? Let us do this for you. And he said, no, I'm not going to let you do this, right? And he explains that, and they say to him, what, will your statement be negated in your lifetime? Like, you can never keep to your opinion? Why aren't you going by what you said? You permit this. Why can't you let yourself, you're sick now, let them mix the oil and the water together? Well, didn't realize the time. And so he says that even though this is my opinion, and I don't retract my opinion, this is my opinion, and he obstinately believes in his opinions, I would never be presumptuous as to violate the statements of my colleagues. Okay, so you see that respect that he had with his colleagues. But again, the time has run out, and hopefully we will be able to touch upon more of these stories in the next shiurim, because we don't have enough time, so we're going to just skip over to the end, to the last 2 sources, that in addition to his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with the Torah, with others, his relationship with Eretz Yisrael. There are different sources that show his love for Eretz Yisrael, and even though he died outside of the land of Israel, he commanded, just this also a beautiful imagery, is that he commanded them to bring his bones up to Eretz Yisrael, but until then, to place the Aron by the shore, so that the sea of Israel will lap with the shore of where he was in Asia Minor, like that they're connected by the seas, right? So again, as we started off with the sea that actually saved him, that the waves, each one brought it to each other. In the end of his days, the waves were what connected him to Eretz Yisrael until eventually he would be brought up to be buried in Israel. And nowadays there is they say it's Sion where he's marked in Tiberia. Not 100% sure. I haven't studied the sugya whether or not is completely accurate, but that's where we go to the kever of Rabbi Meir. Just that image of his aron, of his casket being placed at the shore so that the water would wash up upon, kind of like touch upon, lap up upon his casket, and but again, the same waters that are touching the shore of Eretz Yisrael. And so to end off of Rabbi Meir, the luminary, they tell the story in Kohelet Rabbah, Ma'aseh v'shalcha malchut, the Romans came to the Rabbotain and they said, please send to us a torch, right? Xylophanos, okay? Which is like a big sort of torch, and we want one from you. And they said, how many torches did they have that they're asking for a torch from us, right? Why would the Romans come and ask for a torch from us? They have endless things, right? They have so many stones and they have so many pearls and they have so many torches. Why would they be asking for a torch from us, right? And so kimiduman anu, so it seems to us she'en mevakshim mimenu ela meir panim b'halacha, right? They're not asking for a torch with batteries, a torch, a flame, fire, a torch, right? They're asking us for someone that illuminates people with halacha. And so what did they do? They send Rabbi Meir to the Romans and they would ask him questions and he would respond, Shoalin oto v'hu meshiv. Rabbi Meir, the one that we spoke about in the beginning of the Shir, the luminary, he is also, again, in this parable, right? That this idea of the panas, of this torch, that he is the torch, he is the fire. He was the one that was able to illuminate those around him, and as well, not just the chachamim that surrounded him, but also the Romans, when they wanted to ask these questions, they asked him and he would respond. Okay, so this is the end of our first shir on Rabbi Meir, and Bezrat Hashem in 2 weeks, we will continue with the incredible, really probably my favorite sugya in Gemara of the stories of Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Abuya. So are there any